There is an incident in this week's Torah portion that has perplexed commentators down through the centuries, but not me. The Jewish people are traveling in the wilderness on the way to the promised land, and suddenly they're without water, and they complain. And what does Moshe do? He doesn't talk to the rock as God directed him, but he hits the rock. And God immediately says, because you believe not in me, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Because he hit the rock, Moshe doesn't get into Israel. What was so terrible about what he did? After all, years earlier, a similar incident had occurred. The Jews were without water. They complained. And what happened? God then told Moses to hit the rock and the water poured forth. So if it was okay, then what's so terrible now? There's no definitive answer, but I think if we just scratch the surface a bit, we'll find an insight that not only answers this question of what happened then, but also provides some understanding of what's going on in Israel now. Moshe hit the rock. Why? Was that so terrible when he had done the same thing earlier? Because the circumstances were different, the people were different. The first time Jews complained that they had no water was right after they had left Egypt. Here was a people who just witnessed the unbelievable miracles that took place with the 10 plagues. They had just crossed the Red Sea. Here was a people that witnessed the receiving of the manna from heaven. The Jews had everything going for them. They were invincible. God's taking care of everything. And they complain. Under those circumstances, you deserve a zetz. You deserve a slap across the face. Hit the rock. But in this week's Torah portion, we're talking 38 years later. Now the people have wandered through the wilderness. They've been attacked by Amalek. There's been a rebellion of Korach and his followers. Miriam has died. The spies have come back with a negative report of the promised land. The people are overwhelmed, filled with despair and hopelessness. And so they complain when there's no water. Now's not the time to hit. Now is the time to be a bit more sensitive and understanding. In Israel, there is a minor or major revolution take place, with Bibi Netanyahu being forced out as prime minister after 12 years. What's happened? The bottom line is he's been a successful prime minister. Look what's happened to Israel during these past 12 years. The Iron Dome and startup nation and growing in technology and stopping terrorism within the borders. The economy is growing. And yet 300,000 Likud members who usually vote for him didn't show up at the polls. And the opposition was made up of people who had been his own ministers: Bennett, Saar, Lieberman. Why did they turn? Because this isn't the same Israel that it was 12 years ago. And Netanyahu just kept on doing things as if they hadn't changed. he was still giving all the power to the Haredim at the expense of other Israelis. They made an arrangement for women to be able to participate in services at the wall. He dropped it because of pressure. Time and again, he was not the same man he was 12 years ago. Now he's under indictment for corruption. Now he's calling his opponents leftists and traitors and turning against anyone who won't support him, and taking in as his partners the most right-wing, unacceptable elements of Israel's society. People felt it was time for a change. You couldn't just go on doing things the same way. When you're dealing with an Israel that now is going to have a government with more women in it, going to have a government with an Arab party in it. It's going to have a government with the left and the right and all points in between in it. It's time for a change. You've got to know when to hold and know when to fold. And Bibi Netanyahu didn't know how to separate one from the other. He was still hitting the rock. He could have learned a lesson told about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian's father, who was a doctor and one of the early disciples of Freud. And when he got to be 70, he retired from teaching and from taking patients. And when they asked him why, he said, now I can tell that I am slipping and they can't. If I stay on too long, then they'll be able to tell I'm slipping and I won't be able to tell. There's a lesson in there, even for rabbis. Shabbat Shalom.